On the next episode of Painting and Travel, Roger and Sarah visit one of the most recognized lighthouses in America. Sarah talks with the Portland Head Lighthouse curator inside their museum as Roger sets up his easel to paint along the cliffs.
Today, Sarah and I are in Maine, and this is the Portland Head Lighthouse. I tell you, just being here is a thrill for me. This is a lighthouse that I've loved for a long time. And being here for real, looking down at these beautiful rocks and this beautiful lighthouse is just a great experience. I'm going to do a small painting here, but today I think I'm going to do something just a little bit different. Yesterday I made the sketch on this masonite board, and I'm going to do a study instead of trying to do a finished painting. This subject deserves a full-size painting, so I'm going to do a color study. This will give me the opportunity to look at this lighthouse, study the colors, figure out the textures, what I want to do, and then we'll take this painting along with some reference photographs back into the studio and do a larger work. I think I'll start out by putting in this brilliant blue sky. Generally, I like to start from my darks to my lights, but that's not always a hard and fast rule. And today, I think I'll just start by putting this sky in. Now, one thing I want to be careful of is not to get this sky too intense, because it's such a blue sky now. If I made it as blue as it is, it may take away from the interest of this lighthouse in general. Right now I'm using cerulean blue and white, and I'll put a little bit of yellow and red in there just to gray that down slightly. I'm using acrylics, and I'm using a limited palette of titanium white, ultramarine blue, Indian yellow, cerulean blue, and alizarin crimson.
While Roger finishes getting all his materials in order, let's take a closer look at the lighthouse. The masons who built the lighthouse were given 4 years to build the tower. While it was under construction, the federal government was formed, and George Washington became the first president in 1789. It looked like the lighthouse at that time might not be finished, but Congress appropriated enough money to complete the job 1 year later. The tower stands 80 feet tall and 101 feet above sea level. The light can be seen from as far away as 24 miles at sea. When the fog rolls in, foghorns help guide mariners through the area with the additional assistance of the Ram Island Ledge Lighthouse, about a mile away. We're inside the museum here at the Portland Head Lighthouse, and this is Jean Gross, who is the director. Jean, I understand that the lighthouse was begun in 1787 under the directive of George Washington, when Maine was still part of Massachusetts.
Yes, and it was actually completed in 1791. One of the first acts of the newly formed Congress at that time was to take all lighthouses from state control and put them under the federal government. And this was the first lighthouse completed after that act was signed into law.
You know, I also read that George Washington was paying attention to the budget, and so he had the local masons use materials found in the area.
There were 2 local masons that probably gathered rock from the fields right next to the place here. It was rubble stone, it's just a local rock, and probably was dragged over here with a team of oxen, and they began to construct the tower. and continued on up until it reached the desired height.
So over the years, I guess there were a few adjustments. Perhaps the mariners couldn't see it. They made it taller.
Well, they adjusted the height several times during the first 100 years for different reasons. And so it's been raised, it's been lowered, and finally they got the perfect height in the late 1800s. But if you take a look at the lighthouse, you'll see a ring around it, and that's pretty much where all the adjustments took place.
This is a wonderful museum. This is quite a gem here. What exactly order is this lens?
This is an example of a fifth order Fresnel lens. It was manufactured in France in the 1800s.
And what makes it the fifth order lens?
It's the size. The first order is the largest, and then they're descending order down. So this is a fifth order, and it's one of the smaller lenses.
It's in very nice shape, and I think it's always difficult to find a lens in such good shape because there's some vandalism that goes on over the years.
Well, now these are very well protected. For the few ones that are left in the United States, they're very valued and well taken care of for the most part.
Yes, and I noticed that this whole park is very well maintained. Is this a city effort?
The Fort Williams Park is a town-owned park by the town of Cape Elizabeth, and they maintain it, and it's free, and that's provided by the citizens of Cape Elizabeth. This part, Portland Headlight, is a project of the town of Cape Elizabeth, and it's well maintained by the funds that are raised here in the museum and the shop sales in our museum shop.
I noticed inside the museum you have some other artifacts that are quite interesting. Perhaps we could take a close-up of a couple. Jean, you said that this is the second order Fresnel lens?
This is the original lens that was installed here at Portland Headlight. It's a second order lens. It was manufactured in France, and it was shipped here probably in pieces, packed in crates of straw. And it was assembled here when it reached the lighthouse.
It's really beautiful. It's very jewel-like, and I think you could stand up if you were inside it. It's just huge.
Yes, and this is only half of it. We have a whole other half of it that's in storage. It wouldn't fit in the museum here. But actually, when you see this and the sunlight is coming in the window, you'll see all the colors, the prism effect of the way the glass is shaped and placed.
That's just the real jewel of the lighthouse, isn't it? Having that in place with the light.
Oh, we're very fortunate to have such a wonderful artifact.
Thanks to the early lighthouse keepers, we do have a lot of interesting history that we can study, and we have beautiful artifacts and many ports that have been settled because of them. So it's a real treat to be here. Thank you, Jean, very much.
Oh, you're most welcome. I'm glad you came to visit.
Oh, it's great.
Yesterday there was a little bit of fog in the area and the foghorn was sounding, but today we just have the sound of the surf down here right below us. I did try and make an accurate drawing of this, or fairly accurate, but I'm not going to worry about that too very much. Between yesterday when I drew this and this morning I decided that I really wanted to do that larger painting, so I won't really bother with the brush strokes too much. Brush strokes look a little rough. That's okay with me. Painting is about adjusting the colors all the time. So this color I'm putting on here now of the sky may not be the color I'll use in the finished painting, or in this sketch I should say. And I won't know that until I get some more colors on here, because this is always about associating one color with another. These rocks are quite complex, and yesterday when I sketched this, the light was coming from this direction. Now it's coming from the east, of course, because it's morning. So I get a whole different picture of what this looks like today. Ultramarine blue, yellow, and red. I'll just mix all these three colors together, and that's the color I use as a base. If I want it a little warmer, I put some more red in it. If I want it a little cooler, I put some more blue in it, and so on. It's kind of nice being able to start out with just those three colors. It simplifies this process a whole lot in the field. I'm going to put these rocks in here a little bit dark. Then I'll put these highlights over the rocks. But there's a lot of cracks and crevices in these rocks. by putting these lights over these darks once it dries, the darks there and these crevices will show up. The water seemed a lot bluer for some reason. Today it's a very gray-green down here. It's one thing I can count on always when I'm painting outside is that things are going to change from minute to minute. So I might ask myself, what's the advantage of painting outside? Well, for one thing, I can see much more color than I can from a photograph. I think I'll make this all that darker gray color. There we go. A little more cerulean blue, white. Mix it with a little bit of that grayish color I've already got there, and that might color this water back here. No, that's too dark. It's much lighter back there. If I squint my eyes, which I often do to see this subject, it simplifies it when I squint my eyes. The water right back here in the sky, the water is a little bit darker, but it's pretty close to the same value, so that's definitely dark. But this darker color that I've just mixed up here might make a good color for the water right down here. So my main goal here is just to get these colors in and just observe as much as I can while I'm standing here. It gets very green down here. The water's very clean up here in Maine, I've noticed, for the most part, places we've been. So I think that's the natural, I just think that's the natural color of the water. Sort of a greenish, yeah, right down in here where it's a bit shallow. So we'll just put in a little bit of green down here. Got my spray bottle with me. This really helps keep things a little bit wet since these are acrylics, they dry so fast. Let me see, I'll grab some Alizarin crimson and Indian yellow. Part of painting, you know, is having the experience of being on location. Put these roofs in up here. Now, even though I've drew this fairly accurately, I'm not going to worry a lot about my brush strokes here and everything, not at this point. We got that nice little brick house back there. That's a little bit more yellow than the roof, so we'll just lighten that up just a bit. I'm just going to block in these colors with just sort of big strokes. That side of the house is darker, it's in shadow, so I'll take a little cerulean blue. Now when I put the white on this, it's going to change the complexion of the whole painting. But I'm going to start by not putting the whites in on the lighthouse. I'm going to start by putting the darks in, so I'll mix up a color that I think looks good on that shadow side of the tower. Now when I look at that lighthouse, squinting my eyes to try and determine the color of that shadow, and many times it's very, very close to the color of the sky, only a bit darker. And the reason is that's where the shadow side of the lighthouse is getting all its light from, the sky. Today I'm not seeing it as a darker sky color. It's getting so much influence from the red roof of that house. Okay, so I'll just warm this up. I just took that sky color, that watercolor, put a bit of red in it, and I've used that as the shadow side of the lighthouse. See, I think I'll paint in that whole thing that color, and then I'll go over it with the lighter color just in a minute. Same goes true for these shadows on the houses. Here we have a shadow on the eaves, and I'll use that same color. I'll mix up some ultramarine blue, alizarin crimson, Indian yellow. I'm going to make that darker. I have three choices here. I could put black out of my palette, but I really don't want to do that. Black is really a dead color. I don't see anything dull about this lighthouse. I can make it very rich, dark color with just these three colors. Now we'll just put the bottom part of the lighthouse right there. Now I'm starting to get established with values the way I want them. I haven't put the lights in yet, but we'll get there very soon. But I think maybe this is a good time to do that We'll mix up some warm color, titanium white, Indian yellow. Now, Indian yellow is a very warm yellow, so I could use that on the light side of the lighthouse as opposed to, say, cadmium yellow, because that's a cool color as yellows go. Now, of course, that's not a hard line because it's round and that light bends off or fades off. But this is dry already, even though I just put that on there. It's acrylic, so it's dry. Now, if I spray that, a little bit of water, I can take my yellow again. And I'm not blending this because this is already dry here. But by spraying some water, it lets me flow this yellow a bit easier over the dry paint. I don't want to get it too yellow, but then again, I want to push the color a little bit. Just burnt sienna underneath this board. Since most of these colors are transparent, this warm burnt sienna color is going to show through. That's what I wanted it to do. Gives me that nice warm tone on the board. There's another lighthouse offshore there, and yesterday the foghorns were talking back and forth to each other. It was quite nice. I have this other lighthouse is way out here. I hesitate to even suggest that at all. I'm going to put it in there anyway, but I don't want my eye to bounce back and forth between these two things. Since it's there, it's part of this landscape, I will make a note of that to myself. And maybe when I get home, I think I'll maybe do a longer painting and will include that too. So I'm looking at these rocks and I'm seeing that they're really very warm in color, especially where the sun's hitting them. What I have here is two reds. So I'll put a little more yellow in there and let's give that a try. I'll put a little cerulean blue in here because there's all different planes going on. These planes are going this way, that way. It's a real mosaic, a Rubik's Cube of rock down there. It's really hard to study these rocks. It seems like when I zero in on one to draw, then I look up, I've lost my place as to where it was I was drawing. It's just so complex out there. And that's why I thought it would be a good idea just to make some color notes out here and then enjoy the day. I do notice one thing about these rocks, and that the rocks right in front of us here and below us here are pointing right at me. Over here, they're pointing away, so there's a perspective issue going on with these rocks. You see, we have rocks coming down at this angle, and as we move up, the angle changes. It's almost like we have a vanishing point way out here somewhere, at least with some of these rocks. I'm going to put some highlights here, right on the tops of these rocks. Oops, I forgot the lantern room, didn't I? I'm going to take a very small brush, and just for my own benefit, I don't really need to put it in here in this piece, but it's very important for me to get an accurate proportion of the lighthouse. If the proportion of that lighthouse is off a bit, people may not know exactly what's amiss, but they can tell that something's not quite right. So it's important for me to get those proportions accurate. When I get back to the studio, I'll take these color notes, this little color sketch. We'll work on a larger rendition of this painting. Here I have a 24 by 36 inch canvas, and I have some modeling paste. I'm using an old beat up brush, and I'm putting this modeling paste on. And the reason I'm doing that is because acrylics don't dry and leave a texture on the canvas like oils. I've thinned this modeling paste out just a bit so it spreads around a little bit easier. I don't want it terribly thick, but I do want to get a nice texture on this canvas. After I get it on here, I can tip it to see the actual texture a little bit better. And then I can smooth it out or roughen it up, depending on how much texture I want on the canvas. After applying the modeling paste, I can leave that rough texture, or I can just take that brush and feather that out to the degree I want. My next step after applying the modeling paste is to wet the canvas with an atomizer, get this just a little damp, and tone my board. And I like to tone it using burnt sienna. I could apply this with a brush, but this seems to be the easiest and quickest way to accomplish putting on this tone. It only takes a few minutes for the burnt sienna tone to dry since it was applied very thin. Then using a pencil, I carefully drew the lighthouse and the rocks surrounding it. This was a very important step. Not having the drawing placed accurately would be a major mistake because no matter how long I would spend on the painting, the accuracy of the drawing, composition, and layout are the foundation for all that follows when I paint. I'm beginning to lay in my dark colors with a mixture of burnt umber and ultramarine blue, keeping the paint thin at this point. While the paint is still wet, I spray the canvas with some fine droplets of water. These droplets are going to absorb the wet paint, and at just the right time when the background paint is almost dry, I take a dry brush and gently drag it across the area I just sprayed. If the timing is right, I'll pick up those droplets of water which have absorbed some of the dark color, and it leaves me with a texture that looks like small rocks and pebbles. This process is continued throughout the entire area of the dark rocks. First the dark layer of wet paint, then misting the canvas, waiting a bit until the background is almost dry but not quite, and finally dragging the dry brush over the surface to pick up some of those drops of water which have absorbed the paint. A lot of this will be lost and covered over as I paint, but it gives me an excellent texture to build on. I've decided to block in all the largest areas first. So next comes the sky, made with a combination of cerulean blue, white, and a touch of yellow ochre. More yellow ochre is added to the mix to create a warmer looking bank of clouds. This was put on quite thick as I didn't want any of the burnt sienna that was underneath to show through. Just to be sure that my horizon line was level, I took my ruler, used my fingers from my left hand to guide the ruler along the top of my canvas as I struck a charcoal line across the bottom where I wanted the horizon. The water seemed to be the next largest shape, so I began to apply that area with ultramarine blue, burnt umber, and some white. I added more white and kept that edge at the horizon very soft to give it a feeling of distance. I continued to work the water in and around the rocks on the shoreline, and I already had some texture here on the beach, which made a good start, but it was too warm and too dark. So with a combination of cerulean blue and yellow ochre and white, I began to scumble the sand over this area of pebbly beach. This is really where the texture of the modeling paste I put on before I started painting the canvas comes into play. That underlying texture helps me create this painterly look of rough sand and ruggedness on the beach. I'd lost many of the lines I originally sketched on my canvas, but there were enough of them still showing to give me a guide as to where the dark areas of rocks were, the cracks, and so on. As I'm doing this, I'm continuously looking at my reference photo that I have pulled up on my laptop. Some of the waves were added to the beach with a combination of yellow ochre and white. I'm going at this a bit at a time, not finishing any one thing completely. A few touches of green at the top of this cliff gave me a break from working on all those dull areas of the canvas. Blocking in the keeper's house and the lighthouse was the next thing on my list. I started with thin coats of color to establish my values, and even though these areas are quite small, a large brush worked well, and the reason is that the brush had a good chisel edge on it, so I could get a nice sharp edge. When the brush gets older and worn, that's no longer possible. The shadow side of the lighthouse, although it's a white lighthouse, is getting its light solely from the sky, so it ends up being almost the same color as the sky, only a bit darker. The sunny side of the lighthouse is getting its light from the sun, so I add a touch of yellow ochre to the white to keep it warm. Using a pure white would look cold and out of place. The lantern room was added to the top of the lighthouse, and I tried to pay particular attention to the ellipses and the proportions. Light is always reflecting off nearby objects, so here I added a warm color to the base of the lighthouse where those brick-colored shingles would have been casting some of its light onto the lighthouse. As I worked on the painting, I could see where more attention to detail needed to be added, and at this point I was beginning to jump back and forth between areas, keeping it all going at once. More attention was added to the house and the windows, and all those thin colors I had originally put on there were replaced with more opaque colors. And then I added these fence posts.
Exploring the Maine coast was really great. I hope we have another chance to go back because there's so many things I think we didn't have time to see. Lots more lighthouses and beautiful coves and beautiful parks and quiet places to contemplate and paint and sketch.
Right.
I'll bet you could have done a lot more sketches and paintings if we'd stayed longer.
Yeah, it was beautiful up there. On this painting here, I'm going to take a few more minutes, put a few more touches on it, then we'll take one last final look.
For more information about painting and travel with Roger and Sarah Bansemer, visit paintingandtravel.com.